record tonight's webinar, so you should probably get a pop-up that says you know that that's happening. And with that, I will turn it over to Kristin, and I will continue to look at the chat window and feed questions to Kristin. So if anybody has any questions or needs anything, don't hesitate to type them into the chat.
Great. Thank you, Jen. And so wonderful to see all of you here. Super exciting. Can I get a sort of comments in the chat that you all can hear me and this is coming through live? There's like lots of tech pieces going on today. So I just want to make sure before I launch too far in. Yes, perfect. Awesome. Thank you. So fantastic. Wonderful to see. Ooh, look at all of these coming through. I love it. I love it. As Jen said, my name is Kristin. I run Dataspire Education and Evaluation, and I'm just so super excited to talk to you all today about this helping students muck about in their data. It might be quite possibly one of my most favorite topics to talk about. The other one being the webinar that I got to do with you all, this community last year, which is graph choice and helping kids think about how to be graphing their data and things like that. Really what I do is helping teachers and students think about how do we actually make sense of data. And as we are going through and participating today in the webinar, I really encourage all of us to participate fully, openly, inclusively for ourselves and for everyone else. There are so many similarities between where we work and what our experiences have been, but there are also some really key differences. And I don't know about you all, but my 4th period always had differences from my 7th period, for my 6th graders. So like even within the same school, there were differences, students to students, class to class. So I just really encourage us to use our I statements as we are sharing out and participating so that we can create this open, inclusive environment for everyone. Because for some of us, we might be a little pushed onto our learning edge. It might feel a little uncomfortable, and that's okay. My hope is that we can be sort of right on that zone of proximal development, right on that, like we're a little uncomfortable, but we're stretching and learning, but not like, oh, we've launched off the cliff into overwhelming, or we're in the like, ho hum, we've done this already. So just as that caveat of like, we're gonna be doing some things. This is active hands-on. I've put in the chat, and Jen, if you could keep putting in the chat a link to that resource document so everybody can get into that Google document together. So as I said, what I really work with the schools and districts and educators and organizations that I work with is helping unpack this process of working with data. And when we work with data, there are always 4 things that are involved. We need to have data, we need to explore that data, we get to do that to infer meaning from data. And you might be thinking, well, it says 3 realms, how are there 4 things? Because this you, so in today's experience, that's going to be us individually, we each are going to be participating, but then also having that hat as the facilitator of how am I creating that space for my learners so they are actively engaged, so they realize they are that critical puzzle piece in the middle that keeps those 3 realms together. As we're working in each of those realms, there is a lot that goes in to doing each of those things, the getting data, exploring data, inferring meaning from data. And so this is just my like, we're not going to cover it all in the next hour, but we're going to drill down a little bit deeper into thinking about this visualizing and filtering, transforming, simplifying these components that go into the exploring data and how we can set our students up to have more confidence and excitement about that piece, which is so critical for the describing and analyzing patterns and the interpreting data to mean something. That analyzing, interpreting data, that piece where we're going towards, where we want them to get to. And if we think about these 3 realms, that's what opens up the space so that we can build complexity over time and that our students can have these rich, data-rich experiences working with data. So that is my hope. That is the context of where we are coming from. I may use the term data literacy, so just want to share this out at the beginning of what do I mean by that? Well, it's, the small thing of the ability to collect, organize, visualize, analyze, interpret, and share data for yourself and others to understand. Just a few things. That is a big definition. We cannot accomplish that in one lesson, one unit, even 1 year. This is something that we build a progression in. We gain this over time. And a key part of that is this mucking about and exploring the data. But before we get there, I think it's helpful for us to step back and sort of think about and remember that data has context. And to put us into this headspace, we've all had busy days with lots of things going on, balls juggling every different direction, maybe some balls dropped. Yep, it's okay. Life's in session. I want to ground us in this quote from John Tukey. Before we can even begin to test your ideas against evidence, it's essential to get a good feel for what your data look like. So we're going to take a minute and a half to sort of sit with this quote and think about what do you think about this? What might be resonating? How might this relate to what you are doing with your students? And I encourage you all to either share out your thoughts in the Zoom chat where we are, or all these awesome anonymous animals are in here. Those that have landed in our shared resource document, you can type it right in here into that shared resource document as well. So let me pull back up the quote. Before you can even begin testing your ideas against evidence, it's essential to get a good feel for what your data look like. Okay, I'm going to stop talking so you can think, process that, type your answers either into the Google document or into the Zoom chat. There's some great ideas coming forward. Let's take about 15, 20 more seconds to kind of wrap up the thought that we have, share it out in the chat, share it in the Google document. Awesome. So some things that I'm seeing coming through are that you have a good idea of what your data are representing and maybe what they obtain or constraints that they have. I'm also seeing the sort of the super basics that as we process our data, kind of keeping it visual, and what that offers and how they visualize the data can depend on what question they're asking. Our understanding of the data is influenced by all of these different components. These are all fantastic, super exciting to see these pieces. John Tukey, I should have said, is a sort of a grandfather in the world of data visualization and thinking about how do we process information? How do we think about information? We're going to do a shared experience here that might be a little different than what you were expecting when you came to today's session. And we're going to pretend like all of us from all of our different positions, wherever we are, have all gotten on a bus, or we've all convened at Yellowstone National Park. We're really excited to see Old Faithful erupt. But as luck would have it, as it usually goes, it has just erupted, and so we missed it. But we've driven in from all these different places, driven, flown, ran, walked, whatever, however we got there. there are lots of other things we want to see in the park. So we're not interested in just sort of like sitting around for forever waiting for Old Faithful to erupt again. So we're trying to figure out when will the next eruption be. Fortunately, there's a park ranger there who has shown us some data. And so we are going to use some data to think about how could we use these data to answer this question of when will the next eruption be? How can we decide how much time we can leave to then come back to try to actually see Old Faithful erupt? Now, these data are pretty wonky, so let me give you a little bit of orientation to this large screen of data that you are now looking at. First off, I want to say the data are from 15 days, and they are from August 1990. But the great thing about Old Faithful is that it's pretty faithful, so we can use these data to think about when the next eruption would be here in 2023, in January. The second thing I want to orient you to is that in this data table, the way it's organized, each row is a date in August, and then each column is the time until the next eruption. So from when they started recording to the first eruption, it took 80 minutes, and then it took 71 minutes, and then it was 57 minutes, and then it was 80 minutes, things like that. This data table, I want to say, is also in the shared resource document. So if you're playing along in the Google document, it's at the top of page 3. So you can, if that's easier for you to look at, you can look at it there. So what I'm asking for you all to do is spend a minute and think about using these data, either two things. One, if you love numbers, great, jump in and try to figure out an answer to when the next eruption will be using these data. If this many numbers sort of makes your eyeballs swirl, then don't worry about that. What I'm going to ask you to do is think about how could we use these data to think about when the next eruption might be. So this is quick. A minute goes by quickly. So we're going to take 1 minute to think about either an answer, a numeric answer, or a process. How would we go about answering this question with these data? Okay, as I said, a minute goes quickly. So curious to hear, again, either in the Google document or in the chat, what were folks thinking, either in terms of a number that they were getting or a process of how they would go about using these data to answer that question. When will the next eruption be? And we talked about earlier, I'm talking a little bit because it takes a little while to write things in the chat. Someone brought up earlier that sort of what question we have drives how we visualize our data. What question we have drives how we interact with the data, how we explore those data. So I'm seeing find the range. Ooh, I love it to sort of know when the earliest and then the latest would be so that we could use that as a gauge to think about when the next eruption will be. Any other thoughts that were coming up in terms of range? If you didn't want to miss the next eruption, Jen's saying, I think you'd have to be back in 43 minutes. That was the lowest number. So again, we're sort of anchoring into that, okay, what's our lowest? What time would we need to be back? So the lowest number, awesome. So there's a lot of we're going to play it conservative. We've driven from all these places and we want to make sure we don't miss it. Awesome. I love it. I love the way that we're thinking. I appreciate this real clear vision on wanting to make sure we see Old Faithful erupt. When we present this to students, oftentimes what students will say is that we should take the average of looking through all of these data. So let me show you. If we were to think about taking an average, and sometimes our students will say, well, we could take an average for each day, and then we could average our daily averages to figure out when the next eruption might be. And then, I don't know about you, but my students love to make bar charts. And so I put it on a bar chart for us so that we could look at. So if we the daily averages ranged from 70 to 75. So that sounds like it's a tighter range than if we had just gone with the minimum and the maximum. I don't know if anybody put the maximum in the chat. So it's a little bit tighter. So we'd have, this would give us maybe 30 more minutes to explore the park than if we just came back at the lowest number. If we took an average of all those daily averages, we end up around 72 minutes. What's really interesting when we plot all of the data from that table, this is what we get. This is how our data come out on a dot plot or a line plot, depending on what age your students are and how you refer to this graphical representation of data. And what's really interesting is geologically is a whole other question, but data-wise, Old Faithful is bimodal. So there is a peak around sort of 50 to 55 minutes. If we come back at 43 minutes, we might be waiting a really long time until Old Faithful might erupt again. There's sort of a peak around 50 to 54, and then there's another peak here around 72 to every 84 minutes. When we go with the minimum, then we could be waiting around for a really long time. When we go with the averages, we miss this whole first mode, this whole first hump of them. I don't know about you, but when I looked at that table of numbers, I did not see that the data were bimodal. That did not come out to me. When I look at that table of numbers, my eyes start to swirl and I can't really make sense of it. And actually, to be totally honest, my body sort of shuts down. But when I look at the data presented this way, when I actually visualize the values, then I'm drawn in to think about what might be going on. Why might there be two modes? How do we then answer this question of when the next eruption might be? I find it a much more engaging way to think about the data, to think about the question we have, and it generates more questions. It's this kind of opportunity that we want to create for our learners. We want them to actively participate and to ask those questions and to be curious and to dive in. And one of the ways that research shows that we can create that active engagement is by giving them opportunities to explore the data, to visualize it, to make sense of it, to tinker around in it. What I call is sort of this mucking about in the data. So we are going to go through a structured format, a strategy of how we can create that opportunity for our students to muck about in the data, recognizing that this might feel really different for our learners. This might feel really uncomfortable. They might not be used to it. They might look at us like we've grown four heads and they're like, but what is the answer? What do you want me to see in these data? And so we're going to go through this structure together as adults ourselves to experience it. And then I'm going to talk about at the end sort of why it is designed the way it is and what opportunities that affords in terms of the design. So bear with me as we go through this. So we're going to think about similarities and differences, and we're going to look at bird data because of where we are. So we are going to think about, first thing we're going to do is we're going to spend, before we look at any data, before I throw any more data at you, I want you to just think to yourselves, we're going to do this in our alone zone, think to yourselves so you can write down on a piece of paper. If you're a writer, if you're a doodler, you can draw doodles, whatever you would like. I just strongly invite you to actually put something down, either analog on paper or digitally on your device. Research shows that that is cognitively different for us than just staying in our head and thinking about it. When we actually commit to putting something down digitally or on paper, that's a different things happen inside of our brain as we're processing that information. So the two prompting questions, which are purposely open-ended, is I just want you to think, this is just sort of free association, what comes to mind when you think about how do observed birds change day to day? And let's ground this a little bit, let's say like in our backyard. And how do observed birds relate to the weather? Like what birds you might observe in your yard, how does that relate to the weather? How do the birds that you might observe in your yard change day to day? So are there any clarifying questions about what I'm asking you to do for the next 2 minutes? If so, drop them in the chat so that I can have a sense of if we're clueless or if folks are on board with this next step. Okay, so Not seeing any. Great, all set is what I'm hearing. If you still have questions, don't worry, drop them in the chat, happy to answer them. But I am going to start the timer for our 2 minutes of writing, reflecting, doodling, however you would like. Great. So as we're getting to the ends of our 2 minutes, I encourage others to follow Anne's lead and feel free to share out in the chat what were some things that were coming up. I'm seeing similarities or maybe more obvious. So I'd start there, sort of being drawn to looking for similarities. Day to day, I think, is what you're responding to with that question. Jen saying you could probably answer both questions over the same time period. Ooh, so we're thinking about like, what's another factor that might be a component of this, and maybe putting some boundaries around when we might want to get at asking these questions or thinking about it. Thinking about Christy saying, thinking about the environmental impact and some key characteristics that are coming through. So our brains are starting to turn on both like, what do we know? What do we think about these questions? And also, I love it. We're already jumping forward to this like, well, and what else could I ask? And how could I look at some data? I guess that totally makes sense. We're here to talk about data, to think about how to answer those questions. Those are really broad questions. So I'm going to narrow us down a little bit, narrow our focus for this exploration to think about sort of how do the number of birds vary with temperature. Okay, so I haven't like fully narrowed it down to like a super tight testable question, but I have given us a little bit more of a sort of guardrails on what it is that we're going to be doing and how we might explore, right? It's not weather largely, it is temperature. It's not like how do birds, observed birds change, because that could be the kinds of species and things. So I'm grounding us in like the number of birds that we might be interested in. And why am I spending so much time explaining this question? Well, because we have a question, we have an inquiry, and then we go look at some data to explore that. And the way that we find those data are in our shared resource document. So we are now here, let me make this driving question visible so that you can see it. We're gonna kind of roll with that one. Slightly sidestep, I kind of set this one up ahead of time to see sort of where we were going because we're a little bit short on time. But if we jump in here to this bird sleuth example data set, I want to explain a couple of things. One, I have compiled a data set for us to look at, a shared data set. I pulled it from a couple different bird sleuth manuscripts out there. So this is a fictitious data set that comes from real data tables, but I merged a couple different experiments together so that we could have a bit of a richer data set to play with for this shared experience today on the call. The other thing that I want to say is I have uploaded this data set into a program called Tuva. I am in no way, shape, or form saying that you all should purchase the Tuva premium product, but I have found that it is the easiest way that we can together experience the shared data set and play around with it. So when you click on that link, if you do not yet have a Tuva Basic or Premium account, Tuva Basic, you can access their tools for free and upload 5 data sets. You will be prompted to put in your email address and what role you play at your school. I'm talking a little bit through this so you have some context, and also so you have some time to do that while I am talking. So again, like, you should be able to get in here for free to be able to play around with this data set that you have. And the reason why I think that's important is, let me orient you a little bit to how Tuva works. It is an interactive drag and drop feature. So, and if you've got questions about this tool or other graphing tools, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But as I said, this one is one that I found that kind of most quickly helps us get in and exploring the data in this type of an experience, shared experience through Zoom. So if you click on the table view down at the bottom, you can get a sense of what are the data that I uploaded for us to play with, and what the different attributes or variables are depending on what field you work in. You can also see what those attributes or variables are along the left-hand side. And when I said it's drag and drop, I really mean it's drag and drop. So I could look at, maybe I'm interested in looking at the time of day, and then you see the dots have now shifted and they've aligned. So now I have a sense of, you know, this many observations were made in the morning and this many were made in the afternoon, and maybe I want to see how the barometric pressure relate, you know, what's the distribution of temperature. Sorry, I grabbed temperature from the morning and the afternoon. And then maybe I want to color it by were squirrels seen or not. Okay, so what I am showcasing, this actually doesn't get at our question of how do the number of birds vary with temperature, because that's the question you guys are about to explore. And you are going to do this. We're going to spend 5 minutes of playing around, tinkering, but I just wanted to give you a sense of, it's easy to drag and drop. Maybe you're not interested in time of day. Maybe we want to look at the number of birds that we see by time of day and whether or not the squirrels are seen, or maybe you're not interested in seeing if the squirrels were seen anymore. Tuva is a very forgiving platform. It's the other reason why I've uploaded the data into this platform for us to play with. So we're going to take 5 minutes, and we're all going to sort of play and tinker and explore around in the data. Just as a reminder, we're on page 3. It says play around with the bird sleuth example data shared. That's the one that you want to click on to be able to get into this data set that I was just sharing out. If you've got any questions or any problems are coming up, please feel free to drop them in the chat or drop them in the Q&A. And I'm happy to answer those questions, but I want to create some space so that we each get some time to explore these data for a bit, and then we'll come back together and keep talking and go to the next step of the activity. So have fun playing around, mucking about, tinkering, trying, testing, iterating, playing around with those data with the question in mind of, how do the numbers of birds vary with temperature? That's the driving question that we're working towards. That's the anchor that we're using as we explore and play around with these data. Okay, we've got about 1 more minute on this tinkering and playing. Oh no, Anne, can you get them back? Okay, excellent. So 5 minutes goes quickly, I know, but we got a little chance to explore around a little bit. And what I'm curious to hear from you all is, what were you plotting where? What kinds of things, which of those attributes were you pulling over maybe before they got lost? So sorry. And great thing, you can't break it. You can just start again, recreate it, put them all back in. Well, annoying for time, but at least you didn't totally ruin, lose all the data. And what kinds of plots were you making? And what we're going to try to do is, if you guys could share these out in the chat, then I am going to screen share the data table. And Jen, if you could hop in and let me know sort of what are folks sharing out in terms of the kinds of plots that they were making, or some questions that were coming up, things that you were doing as you were exploring the data. I'm gonna, because we unfortunately can't share screen in the webinar format, this is my workaround for how we can, as if we were in breakout rooms and sharing screens with one another. So let's see, what are, anybody want to, okay, plotting birds versus mammals. So we've got, okay, so maybe number of birds, and then actually I'm going to put that down on the horizontal axis, and then thinking about squirrels seen, or maybe we're actually putting it up here, sort of squirrel seen, how that's connecting in. And please feel free to jump in the Zoom chat if there are other things that you were doing that I'm not fully interpreting how you were playing with the data. Any other thoughts? What were some other graphs folks were making? I should say, there are no right or wrong answers. We all had 5 minutes to orient to a new data set, orient to a new tool, and play around with a narrower but still pretty open question. Okay, so actually the horizontal axis was date. Great. Maybe we were thinking maybe something like that. Number of birds versus the date. Anybody else want to share out what they were thinking about? While we are here, I will jump in. Oh, thinking of your kindergarten students, keeping chickadees and exploring each type of display. Oh, I love it. Okay, I'm going to go there in just a quick second. Jen asked a question of, can we put in a line of fit? And so there are two ways that we can do that. Just on this sort of number of birds versus date, if we were to think about sort of, is there a difference between the between when there are not squirrels present and when there are squirrels present? Okay, I'm also seeing, is there a way that we can put two variables on the y-axis? So we were seeing black-capped chickadees and thinking around how that looks. Let's say we're also curious about looking at the number of stellar jays. So this gets at the question of, can we put two variables on an axis? Yes, you can put it on both axes. Things like that. A dot plot of temperature versus number of birds. Or actually, maybe you meant that to be the other way around, that the temperature versus the number of birds and thinking like that. And then we could show that there's sort of another way that we could do a line of fit where we're kind of eyeballing it within our data, different pieces like this. I was looking at, awesome, okay, birds on the Y and temperature on the X with barometric pressure. Ooh, I love it. Okay. So I'm going to add barometric pressure as a color to that. And what we see is there are some gray dots showing up here, and that's where barometric pressure wasn't recorded, but there was a temperature and a number of birds for those given days. Awesome. Excellent. Okay. So what you have now seen, we've spent 3-4 minutes sharing out some different ways that we were thinking about getting at this question of, how do the number of birds vary with temperature? We all had the same data set, but we were graphing different things. We were coming at this question from different perspectives, different angles. Maybe as you were watching me demonstrate on the screen, because you all couldn't demonstrate for each other in breakout rooms, you saw some things. So you're like, oh, maybe I can explore it that way. Maybe I could try this other thing. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take 4 minutes and you're going to go back to the data set and keep exploring the data. So make an iteration of your graph, add a different variable, add an annotation to it, add some component that deepens your exploration for this question of, how do the number of birds vary with temperature? There's lots of ways you can explore this data. If you would like to take it one step further, if you'd like to take an extension, you could think about, and what might be driving that? So if you're excited about the extension is, what might be driving that change? What might be drivers of that change being our number of birds and with relation to temperature. If you're excited just to stay and iterate on what you were doing and make a different type of graph in the path of the exploration you're at, great. We're going to spend 4 minutes doing that, sort of jumping back into the data, and then we will come back together for the next step. Okay, 4 minutes goes quickly as we are playing with the data. Well, I should say, for some of us, it might feel really quick. For some of us, it might feel like time just stretches on and on and on, because maybe we're feeling a little like, oh, we're like really pushed into our learning edge. So a couple of things that I want to share. If we could all come unmute, or if we could go into breakout rooms, this would now be a great opportunity for us to share out with one another what we were exploring, what we were finding as it related to our question of how do the number of birds vary with temperature, was that driving question that we were going after. But because we can't do that, and because we only have an hour, what I'm going to do is we're actually going to jump forward to the last step of the structure. And because I want to give you guys some time for their 2 minutes to do this the reflection piece at the end of the structure. And then I'll explain a little bit about what the structure was and the method to the madness, and then give you a little bit more context for that resource that I dropped in the chat. So the questions that I have for you, again, you can write, you can doodle, whatever you would like to do, though it's sort of challenging to doodle in a Google Doc. What did you learn? So pick one of these 3 questions, I should say. If you want to respond to more than one, great, but just think about sort of one of these questions. What might be you thinking of? What did you learn and want to be sure you remember? And this is purposely broad. So it can be specifically about birds and temperature, or specific attributes we're looking at. It can be about exploring data as a concept. It can be about engaging with the data. It can be about the structure. What specifically changed your understanding? What was your explanation before versus what it is now? Or what remaining questions do you have? So you can drop this in the Zoom chat, or there are places in the quick write where you can jump right into this shared resource document that we're working from, and you can pick a line and you can drop your responses there. So let me pull this slide back up. So 2 minutes to each reflect on one of these questions. Okay, so as you all are sort of wrapping up, thinking about your reflections, what I want to do is I want to unpack a little bit the structure of what we did. This is very purposely designed to move between time by ourselves, and then time within small groups, and then time within full groups, and things like that. We started with some questions that were broad and open-ended to access our prior knowledge, to think about set us up on a pedestal of, oh, we know something, we have some ideas. And that actually generated some ideas of how we could explore data if we were going to step into that. When we run this with students, we have them turn and talk to one another in partner groups. This is not a big group. This is a way for them to share out with one another and build each other's confidence in that prior knowledge and spark some new ideas as they're thinking about it. We oriented you to the data set, and then you were given 5 minutes to explore it by yourselves. It is 5 minutes. It is intended to be short as an initial exploration, so that if you are launched out of that learning edge and into the overwhelm, you are not spinning out of feeling overwhelmed and totally shutting down. And if you are shutting down, it's okay. We will come back and we will circle back to you within 3 or 4 minutes. But then we talk to one another. So when we do this with students, or where we can get into breakout rooms, you are actually talking to each other and sharing out with one another. It's an opportunity for peer-to-peer instruction that reduces barriers to entry. It's a way to build confidence because they learn from each other of like, oh, well, I explored it this way, or I explored it that way. There's no right or wrong answer as long as it's on topic with the question. Then once you had that opportunity for the peer-to-peer opportunities and instruction, we then went back so you could integrate that understanding with the data and explore it a little bit deeper. Now, we should say, we are very much in the camp of exploring data. We have not gotten to the describe or analyze or the interpret for meaning. These are really helpful precursors to set students up for more success with that analyze and interpret data. So we're focusing on that initial explore piece. Then we would have shared out as a group, and then you had time for some individual reflection going forward. And so all of those pieces are designed to build off of how we can build confidence and create opportunities to practice. We practice in the program called Tuva. Jen put in the chat that CodeApp is a completely free resource that is very, very similar. All of these four, the HHMI Data Explorer, which is also fully free, CodeApp, Data Classroom, and Tuva, are 4 tools that are like fully designed for the thinking about exploring data. Desmos is another one, though Desmos is a graphing calculator, so it's similar but slightly different. And then there are some other options. We specifically did not do this in Google Sheets because Google Sheets oftentimes lends itself to a like, I can't make it work. And we get a little more of a like executional, how do I make the tool work? And less of the like, how do I just tinker and iterate and play around? So I did share in the Zoom chat a link to a resource where we're asked constantly a sort of like, well, which would you promote? And the answer is, we are tool agnostic because we think that there are pros and cons to all of them, but we put them all here in that link that I dropped for you of like benefits and limitations for each of these tools. It comes down to like, what's your budget? What's your purpose? What do you want your students to be doing? So I just want to share out, again, not promoting that you need to purchase Tuva. It's just a tool that works really well in this space. And then I've captured some ideas that we've had in other experiences of working with schools and districts and teachers and informal educators on how they can get students playing around with their data. So I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure we can open it up to some questions. There are just a few final things that I'd like to share out with you as we go out and think about this. How do we help our students muck about in the data? How do we help build their confidence in that initial pieces of playing with the data so that and this is a key piece, so that it doesn't feel like this fire hose of data coming at us. And then we're just supposed to, make meaning from it and think about how it works. This exploring data piece that we were playing around with today, we talked through a structure or strategy of how you can set that up for your learners, is intended to help us generate insights and ideas, to get familiar with the data in order to make sense of the data. So we're not at the making sense. It's a foundational step to get there. And so it's okay, well, here's our question, and now let's just jump in and see what we can see with some data. Once we've gained those insights, then we can move into the explaining and the making sense and the making meaning, the analyzing and interpreting, the understanding what's that thing that I would like to show out for someone. This is what our students publish in bird sleuth. This is what they put together for their science fair projects. That's the explaining piece. This one arrow in here is like when we're explaining with our data, we want our titles to tell you what the claim is, to tell the reader what the claim is. So that's what's going on here. So just want to share out that data has context and it is constructed. And so helping our students sort of understand that piece of it and exploring it, and that time spent exploring isn't wasted time. We spent 19 minutes. When I do it with students, if we're like really diving into it, we can build this out to 45 or 90 minutes. But as you saw, like within 20 minutes, we had an initial experience exploring the data. So we can like think more openly about how we use that time. And that exploring is different from explaining. Cognitively, we are doing different things when we're exploring data versus when we're explaining data. And it's not an either or, it's a both and. They're both needed. So where are we creating those opportunities for our students to do some of that exploration? Or are we always asking them to explain? Are we always sort of leapfrogging from like data collection to explaining with data and skipping this exploring piece within the data? Just as a quick reminder, there's lots of pieces that go into making sense of data. And we've talked about kind of how to tease out like 2 of these, like really sort of the visualize to get us to that analyze. So I'm gonna pause. Hopefully some of you are giggling out there. What we're trying to do is support everyone out there so it doesn't feel like you keep having to use the square wheel, but that instead you can use the round wheel. This structure, this strategy is one of those ways that we can create that space for our learners. I am going to pause there. Jen, have any questions come through as I've been going along, or also participants, if you'd like to drop in any questions that you might have or comments that are things that are coming up, please feel free.
I didn't see any, Kristin, but admittedly, I was busy playing around with the data as well, so I'm not sure if I would have found it.
Yay! That is like a total success. Like I just got totally lost in exploring and playing with the data
today. I thought I got to play and muck about.
Okay, so folks, jump in if you have any questions. If I'm missing them, I am doing that, like trying to talk and facilitate and scroll through the Zoom chat at the same time, which is, you know, those multi hats that we all wear as educators at every moment. I'm not seeing any that are like immediately jumping out, but I do want to say there are some questions that came through on the Google document in that last reflection we had. And what I will do later this evening is I will go back in and through the comments add some responses. So this resource document that we have is really a living document. It's going to change so that we all can't edit it going forward, but you will forever have access to this as a sort of a living document, an artifact, one might say, of this shared experience that we have had together going through this. So coming back to this, like I'm hoping that you don't feel so busy. If you're interested in other resources, ideas, strategies, things like that of how to help students muck about at the data, I have many opinions about Facebook, but one of the opinions that I do have is that it can be a really effective way to share out resources. So there are a bunch of resources at the bottom of the resource document. So let me actually that out before we end our time today here together. So we've been working up here and sort of like above page 4, kind of above the fold, there are post-workshop resources that hit here on pages 5 and 6. So please, by all means, jump in and explore those. If there are ones that you're looking for, but that you don't see there, let me know, because I would be happy to add those in or share others out with you. If you are interested, there's some free webinars coming up to talk sort of more about this kinds of things and how we can bring this more broadly to your schools or districts. And so if you're interested, just wanted to let you know, my big thing is getting you the resources. And with this sort of caveat and reminder of there's a lot that goes in to making sense of data. It is a process. We need to think of ourselves as that critical puzzle piece in the middle, thinking back to that initial diagram that we saw. And we also need to remind ourselves that it's a marathon, not a sprint. So as facilitators of our learners in whatever capacity they are, let's make sure we are setting ourselves up for success and our learners up for success by wearing our running shoes, not our track spikes, as we are trying to help our students build these data skills, work with their data as they're collecting data, maybe from their backyard feeders or different things. Like, just breathe into the, like, it takes some time. It's a big thing to make sense of data and process it. So with that, I thank you so much for your time and everything that you do every day. Jen, I turn it back to you if you've got any closing words for us.
Thank you, Kristin. I appreciate you being here with us tonight, and encourage everybody to check out the Dataspire website, because it really has so many great resources on there. And Kristin's such a expert at sharing ways to think about and play with data. So thank you for all that you've done for the Versleuth team as well, or the K-12 team. Anyway, we'll hang out for another minute or two if anybody has questions. Otherwise, you know how to reach Kristin and I if you need any assistance at any time. Thanks for attending the webinar, everyone, and hope to see you next month as well.
Thank you.